Welcome, everybody. My name is Deepa Sriram, and I'm representing the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I will be your host for today. For our webinar, the Uni-versity, Understanding Hispanic versus Latino Culture. Our presenters are Dr. Telleria, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Escobedo. And before I turn the presentation over to them, I just wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and at the end of it, you will get a copy emailed to you either later today or tomorrow of the recording as well as the PowerPoint slideshow that they will be using today. Before I turn it over to our presenters, I'd like to go through and do some housekeeping information with you. In the center screen right here is where you'll see our webinar displayed and any PowerPoint slides our presenters use. You will also see that that screen right now is highlighted in the center. The next item highlighted you will see are some pod areas on the left and the right. We do have a chat area to the left of our screen, and if you have any questions, comments during the webinar, please feel free to type them in, and our presenters will be monitoring them, as will I, and we would be happy to answer any questions or reflect on your comments. Additionally, at the top, you'll see that there is another box. We have a closed captionist also attending today who will be typing in the transcript of this webinar. Additionally, I wanted to let you know that we have a little icon at the top of our screen, and you'll see that it's an icon of a person raising their hand. All of you have come in on a mute. If you would like to have your line unmuted and would like to ask a question rather than type it in the chat area, please press that, and I will go ahead and unmute your line so that you can ask your question. When you are finished, if you click on that again, you will lower the hand. Right now, first thing you'll do is raise the hand. I'll unmute your line. When you're done, you can lower the hand, and then you'll see the icon will disappear. Also, if you need any help with any of the technology side of our webinar today, there is a help icon at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can click on that to get additional information should you experience any technical difficulties. Okay, at this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Telleria, and welcome everybody. We hope you enjoy our webinar today.
Thank you very much, Deepa. And once again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and on behalf of my colleagues, I would like to extend you a warm welcome to Uni-versity, Understanding Hispanic versus Latino Culture. My name is Gabriel Telleria, and just I'll spend 30 seconds introducing myself. I am a contributing faculty member with the School of Public Policy and Administration. And I've been at Walden for 5 years now, and I am born in Managua, Nicaragua, raised in the United States. I lived in Miami for 10 years, from the late 70s to 89. Went to Virginia Tech, where I did my schooling, graduate, master's, and then eventually doctorate. And now I live overseas in Nicaragua, where I currently reside with my family. So this is a topic that's very important to me, and I think it's very important for our institution and for our faculty. So we thought it would be very useful for faculty and staff to understand the differences between Hispanic and Latinos and what the terms mean, et cetera. So for the learning objectives, and we are going to be looking at identifying the differences between Hispanic and Latino culture. Why it's important to understand these differences. We're going to identify and discuss strategies for how to correctly identify Hispanic versus Latino students. We are going to identify the importance of culturally responsive teaching, discuss how faculty can enhance the learning environment for students from Hispanic and Latino backgrounds, but also from diverse cultures in general. Okay, so with that being said, did you know, here's a few interesting facts Did you know that the first city established in the United States was St. Augustine, Florida? Probably many of you knew that. What about the first territory established in the United States was Santa Fe? Okay, the states of Nevada, which you can pronounce them with the English accent, right? But they're actually a lot of these, most of them are terms in Spanish. Nevada, California, Colorado. Okay, so Nevada, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, which is actually montaña, and Florida have names that are in Spanish or have a Spanish meaning. Okay, and did you also know that Linda Carter, for example, Wonder Woman, okay, Anthony Quinn, Mariah Carey, Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead, Catherine Bach, who is commonly known as Daisy Duke in the Dukes of Hazzard, Charlie Sheen, actress Bella Thorne, Christy Turlington, the model, and many, many, many more celebrities are either Hispanic or Latino, okay? And it's important because the idea for this presentation is not to correctly or to try to correctly differentiate between whether one person is Hispanic or Latino, but rather to show how difficult it is and to show faculty that the way to go about managing Hispanic and Latino students is precisely by not boxing everyone in the same box, by not stereotyping and not assuming that if you are from one part that you are this, or that if you come from this country that you are that, or that if you look a certain way you are that, or that if your name sounds a certain way you are that. The idea is to open your minds to understanding that Hispanics and Latinos come in many, many different sizes, shapes, colors, and forms. Okay? So let's talk about some of these differences. Who is a Hispanic? Okay. Who is a Hispanic? Well, first of all, the term Hispanic does not refer to a language, but it refers to a common historical and cultural root, which is the Iberian Peninsula. Okay? For example, in New Mexico, they are proud Hispanics, okay, not Latinos. And by the way, just to stop for a second here, the Iberian Peninsula, we mean Spain and Portugal, okay? So who is a Hispanic? Well, those individuals whose roots can be traced back to the Iberian Peninsula, okay, but also who speak, Hispanics have also been associated with those who speak Spanish or who have ties with the Spanish language, okay? On the other hand, who is a Latino, okay? Now, the term Latino obviously comes from Latin, or in Latin America, okay? Refers to individuals who come from countries from Latin America, not necessarily the tie with Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, but countries in Latin America, okay? But you will see how some confusion does arise between categorizing somebody as a Latino or a Hispanic. Why is that? Well, many, many reasons, okay? For example, the South and Central Americans did not accept or identify with the term Hispanic, okay? And so they associated themselves with the term Latino, okay? However, that doesn't mean that all Central and South Americans identify with that term, okay? The term Latino or Latina, to refer to somebody that is a female, is an ethnic cultural identifier, okay? There's a mistake that the population has generally made, and that is that they use it as a racial identifier, suggesting that Latinos are a race, and Latinos include everybody from Latin America or who speaks Spanish or who looks like they're Spanish or whose name sounds Spanish, okay? So those are the historical and cultural roots of each term, and of course we only have an hour, and this would require and entail an entire class on these cultural roots and the differences. Okay, but for the sake of this presentation, we're going to try and be brief. Now, why is it important, okay, to understand these differences? Well, just to give you a couple of pointers, okay, a couple of points. It's important because, first of all, 17% of the U.S. population is either Hispanic or Latino, okay? Now, only 24% of Hispanics identify themselves with the term Hispanic, which means that many of them don't identify themselves as Hispanic. So it's important to understand which one is which and who. The idea here is to try and get at the heart of how individuals, how our students are identifying themselves, whether they are identifying themselves with the term Hispanic or with the term Latino. For example, not all Hernandezes or Villas or Cruzes, for example, are Latinos. Okay, they could be Hispanics. Okay, Cubans and Puerto Ricans are Hispanics, but they are not Latinos. Okay, now you are likely going to run into many websites and many people who will consider these as Latinos, because the Latino has been used in mainstream, again, to signal everybody that has a Hispanic last name or looks Hispanic or speaks Spanish, okay? And because Cubans and Puerto Ricans speak Spanish, people in the United States specifically associate them with being Latino, when in fact they are Hispanics, okay? Or at least the majority of them would associate themselves with being Hispanic and not Latino, okay? What about Nicaraguans or Salvadorians or Colombians or Peruvians, Venezuelans, and the rest, okay? Okay? It depends. And I think an important point to be made here is that Hispanics in general, or Latinos in general, would rather be associated or rather be categorized by their country of birth rather than as either Hispanic or Latino, especially when we're talking about U.S. Hispanics and Latinos, because myself, for example, I was born in Nicaragua. I don't consider myself a Latino. I am a Latin American, and I consider myself a Latino Americano, but Latino Americano is not the same as Latino because it has a different connotation. The term Latino is a United States connotation given to Latin Americans in the U.S., whereas Latin American is a different term. It's got a different historical and cultural connotation. Okay, so it's important to understand the differences between Hispanics and Latin Americans in the U.S. versus those outside of the United States. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Ernesto Escobedo, who will talk about the strategies for identifying Hispanic versus Latino students.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Telleria, and thank you all for attending our webinar. Can you all hear me okay? I've got my volume here adjusted. And again, Dr. Escobedo, and just by way of introduction, I've been with Walden University. This is my 9th year. Again, I thank you all for attending, and I'm going to be covering some of the highlights. This material is available to you. Certainly, we can send that to you, or we can make that available. But again, I'm going to be covering some of these highlights. So the first thing I want to mention, as Dr. Telleria also mentioned, a lot of this that we're going to talk about really does depend. In other words, you're going to find some variations outside of our discussion. And let me start with one of the first ones that comes to mind, which is outside of Walden, I go by my full name, including my mother's side in my last name. So I am Ernesto Escobedo Gonzalez Molina, Jr. And it sounds long and it sounds complicated and all this, but I identify myself, right, as we're talking about, that this a lot has to do with how we identify. I identify myself as a first-generation Mexican-American, and as such, and as my other Mexican-American counterparts, meaning relatives and acquaintances, business, and so forth, we tend to use our last name from our father and then the last name from our mother together. So again, this is going to be different, right? And whether we're talking about this culture, that culture, Hispanic, Latino, but again, this is another example of how, as Dr. Telleria mentioned, it depends. That's one example. But the key point here in this slide, as we look at the third bullet there, it's more than just a term. It's an issue of identity. In my case, I hinted that I identify myself as a first-generation Mexican-American, okay? So I was telling my colleagues and said this during our face-to-face presentation, I have a blue and a green passport. So again, that's where I connect and I identify with both Mexican-American and Hispanic, but do not connect myself in, at least me personally, do not connect myself to Latino. Why? Well, because my parents are from Mexico, born and raised, and that's, again, my connection to Mexican-American. So a question we pose here, it's not so much that we can gain valuable information by asking where you're from. I mean, it is a start, but of course, many assumptions go into that. And now, I'm going to give you a different perspective. You know, Dr. Telleria is right on point where we can't just go by a person's last name or, you know, where they're from, et cetera, to make generalizations or get an understanding, because sometimes there are major surprises. The flip side to that is oftentimes I do use a person's accent to give me an idea of where they're from or their background, et cetera. And that gives me an idea as to the person's culture, background, belief systems, and so on. In Mexico, for example, there are so many variations, and I'm going to focus my area of discussion here in Mexico. And so if you're in southern Mexico, northern Mexico, et cetera, it really is not difficult to identify a person's accent and sort of place them as to where they're from. So I tend to use this information not as an assumption, but to give me a kind of like a running start as to the person I'm talking to. Now, bringing it back to the class, during the introductions in the class, say week 1, for instance, I'll read those introductions and perhaps make a comment and just to ask and to get a better understanding as to identification of Hispanic, Latino, all right? So those are the kind of things I look for. In the introduction, sometimes I'll find students who will put their first name, last name, and then their mother's last name. Or now, I can't make an assumption. Sometimes women will use their maiden name, married name, right? So there is, of course, that difference, and so I'm very much aware. But again, this is some of the things that I do. So again, the introductions, if we were holding a face-to-face, as I said already, accents, things like that, actually help me. So another difference here that I just want to mention, you know, the Mexican culture is like the American culture, is a very respectful culture. And what I mean by that is in business, here's an example that if you're aware of this, I think you can appreciate the word licenciado, okay, licenciado. In other words, licenciado, originally it started as someone who has a law degree. So if you are an attorney, you would be addressed as licenciado John or whatever, Betty, whatever the person's name. You would identify, and not just in business, but also casual. It's very much a respectful way of identifying a person's accomplishment in business and personal by adding the word licenciado. Now, today it has generalized into someone who has a degree. So if the person has a degree, not necessarily a law degree, but it's a form of respect. So if I was to meet you in business or outside at the coffee shop, I would address you, if I introduce you to someone, I'd like to introduce you to Licenciado John, Licenciada Betty, etc. Again, as that extra form of respect. So if you see that coming from students and in settings where they identify you as Doctor John, Betty, again, that's the culture. So I'm giving you, again, another example there. Let me move to my next slide. I want to make sure we have enough time. And this is the part that's going to be covered by my colleague, Dr. Hernandez, and I'll come back and cover the next slide. Dr. Hernandez?
I think one of the things that we can summarize from what have been presented is that when you're dealing with the Hispanic and Latino population, there are different degrees of acculturation. There are different degree of socioeconomic status, education, a variety of races, and a variety of number of generations that Hispanics have been in this country. By way of introduction, my name is Dr. Hernandez. I am a founding member of the Smithsonian Latino Initiative, and by training, I am an ethnogerontologist and the former secretary of the Department of Elder Affairs in Florida. My main concern today is to give you some of the important core values that regardless of whether or not you identify yourself as a Hispanic or Latino or a person of Cuban extraction, and that's exactly how I will identify myself. I am a U.S. citizen, American of Cuban extraction. And this is important because by that way, by introducing myself as such, I am giving you a clue that my acculturation process to the Europe-American culture have been completed. In other words, if you're going to connect with me, my cultural values are mainly American, but I still identify myself with my Cuban roots. If you're dealing with the Hispanic and the Latino community, the core values that are going to be critical that you can use in order to engage your students are the value of familism, interdependency, and those values are important because most of the Latinos and Hispanic students, they place their family more, the needs of the family are more important than the need of the individual. And sometimes they come back to school because they want to bring honor to the family members. Sometimes the need of the family are going to detract them from pursuing their master or their doctoral degree. So understanding the family and the family importance within the Hispanic and Latino culture is critical if you want to motivate your students for them to continue their educational path, and also if you need to understand why they may be late with the assignments or they may be taking a sabbatical from pursuing their degree, understanding that role of a family becomes important. It's also important if we're going to be creating social change that is meaningful for the Hispanic Latino community. Start with a social change that is going to impact the family, and from the point of view of the family, then the community. In addition to familism as being one of the critical values in both communities, you also have the value of interdependence. Interdependence means that it is okay for me to accept assistance from other individuals. If we have assignments that require teamwork, those assignments are appropriate because I will work with you in cooperation with you. Now, the value of interdependence is completely different from the value of independence. In the Euro-American culture, we value the individual. We value independence. In the Hispanic and the community and the Latino culture is the other way around. We value interdependency and familism. We value teamwork. We value working in cooperation with others. It's also important to acknowledge the value of personalismo. Why is this important? Hispanics and Latinos are loyal, and they develop a personal connection with the faculty member, with the chair of their department, and that personalismo can motivate them to do the extra work to complete their degree, to do the extra work, and to perform well in class. The value of personalismo is also important in the marketing to the Hispanic community, because if I am loyal to my professor, if I am loyal to my university, I will be more willing to recruit others to come and participate in this, in my educational world. The value of personalismo is also important because when I'm doing an assignment, I really trust what the other person that I respect, what other information that other person is giving me. For example, right now in the political environment, we're telling people don't pay attention to the media, don't pay attention to fake news. Well, that really is within the context of the Hispanic culture because I don't pay attention to the media. I pay attention to my friend who is giving me critical information that I'm going to trust. The same thing is applicable to the assignments. Maybe I pay more attention to what the other individuals are telling me than what the book or the theory or the research is telling me about that population. Hispanics' time orientation is different. Let me explain to you. One of the main differences between the Latino and the Hispanic culture is how we are oriented toward time. Hispanics are similar to the Euro-American culture because we want to do things in the present time. Now, we want to make sure that we complete the assignment immediately. Latinos have future-oriented time frames. That means that maybe mañana I will be able to complete the assignment. The sense of urgency is not that relevant. In the case of the Hispanic, the sense of urgency is relevant and is important. So they are oriented toward the present, while the Latino community is oriented toward the future. Another thing that is important to understand is the communication pattern of the Hispanic and Latino students. Communication patterns. If I have a question because I don't understand an assignment, the Latino and Hispanic students are not going to be direct and ask the professor, can you explain this to me? Because our communication pattern is indirect. In other words, we are not going to be logical and precise to the point. We're going to be asking questions indirectly. Professors, faculty members need to understand that in order to help the Latino Hispanic students, we may need to ask the questions ourselves. And by doing that, I will say, for example, to my students, if I were you, I will be asking the following questions of this assignment. By putting the presentation within the context of the professor asking the questions, you are allowing them cultural permission to come back and to say, well, I guess you're right. I didn't understand that, but I was afraid to ask. So be aware that the communication pattern of the Hispanic and the Latino is completely different than the communication pattern that we have learned in the Euro-American cultural value system. In the Euro-American value system, we are direct, logical, and to the point. In the Hispanic Latino community, we are indirect. And that also presents a challenge Because if we give an assignment that is basically a 2-page paper, well, they're going to have a hard time giving you everything in the 2 pages. They may produce 7 pages because of the way they communicate, indirect and going around until finally they present the true issue for discussion. Another important cultural value of the Hispanic and Latino community is the locus of control. In other words, in the American cultural system, the locus of control is the self-made individual. I am in control of my destiny. I am self-made. In the Hispanic community, the locus of control is outside the individual. It's in the hands of God. God is the one that is facilitating my PhD. God is the one that is helping me with this assignment. I use the locus of control in certain cases to motivate my students. For example, I will tell my students, God has given you the opportunity to enter this program. It is up to you to fulfill God's destiny. I am doing that on purpose because I am using their locus of control, and using the locus of control, I am motivating them to continue in their path, to continue with their degree. In the Hispanic and in the Latino communities, there is a hierarchy of power. And in that hierarchy of power, males are usually at the top, followed by age. The older you get, the more power you get, followed by education, followed by socioeconomic status. So the individual comes into a communication with another person with this hierarchy in mind. Professors, faculty members, regardless of their gender, have power in that hierarchy of power because education is very important, socioeconomic status is important. Again, this hierarchy of power that have gender differences, the older you get, that gender difference disappears because age, education, social rank, economic positions balance out. If I am a female professor, I tell my students my accomplishments, not only because I am proud of my accomplishment, but also because this is going to bring that hierarchy of power into balance. And they will respect me not only because I have a PhD, not only because I have achieved the maximum level in my academic rank, but also because at this point I'm also, older, and that will balance whatever gender differences may exist. Please remember that, and this is the difference between the Hispanic and the Latino culture. Remember, Latino culture, Latino is male-oriented. Hispanic is gender neutral. So Hispanics are more open to equality when it comes to the gender differences than the Latino community. One thing that is very important is the environment. We need to have well-structured environment in our classes. It's very important because since the communication style of the Hispanic Latino is indirect, having a well-structured environment in the class is going to help the Hispanic and Latino student understand and benefit from the exchange of information that is going to take place. We mentioned briefly at the beginning of this presentation that respect. I think Dr. Escobedo mentioned respect. Well, the Hispanic culture is very formal. What that means is that titles are important. This is completely opposite of the Europe-American cultural system. In the Europe-American cultural system, we're very informal. You meet me, and the next time I see you, you call me by my first name. That is not necessarily appropriate protocol when you're dealing with the Hispanic and Latino community. I will give you permission to call me by my first name. But this is after you and I have established that personal contact that allows us to communicate freely. So be aware that this culture is very formal, and therefore it is important to show respect. And then the student, even they are students in your class, they do have some type of, resume, accomplishments, acknowledge those accomplishments. And that is your best approach to show respect, and for them to also acknowledge that you're beginning to know the appropriate protocols of interaction. One thing that I wanted to mention is that there are approximately 57 million Hispanics in this country. Of the 57 million Hispanic, the majority of them, approximately 37 million, are U.S. citizens by birth. Let me repeat that. 37 million are U.S. citizens by birth, and in some cases, they have multiple generations in the United States. So don't assume that, all the Hispanics in this country are newly immigrants. Only 19% are newly immigrants to the United States, and those 19 million, of those 19 millions, the majority have some type of legal status. When you're dealing with the Hispanic community, please remember, think of Maslow Hierarchy of needs. The Hispanic community, the Hispanic students, particularly the ones that are new immigrants to the country, they need to start with taking care of food, taking care of shelter, taking care of the family, and after a while, they join the university because they want to self-actualize, just like, the rest of the world. It is therefore important for you to understand the importance education have, the role education have in the self-actualization of this group. Very important. I think, Dr. Escobedo, it's your time to take the final overhead.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. All right, very good. Thank you for your presentation. I want to continue with enhancing the learning environment for students from diverse cultures. So I have some examples here, and I also want to talk about some practical examples of where we see cultural differences, all right? And so one of them that you might find interesting is physical proximity. Physical proximity. In the U.S. culture, there's a certain length that we need, maybe arm's length, arm and a half, and we stand next to one another. In the Mexican culture, it is a lot closer. So I'm giving you some examples here of some cultural differences that hopefully it'll give us more insight, and we're able to see why this is happening, right? It's neither right nor wrong. It's just some things associated with the culture. Another, as was already mentioned, is time. So the Hispanic culture, and that's where I'm going to talk from more than the Latino culture, time really is more fluid. If we say, for instance, class starts at 6 p.m., or let's say there's a wedding reception at 6 p.m., for instance, in the Mexican culture, really, as you might imagine, if you get there at 7 o'clock p.m. for the reception in a Hispanic, let's say, event, you might be the only one there at 7. They might still be putting up the tables and the chairs and so forth. Again, it's not meant to be a disrespect or a form of insult or offense. It's just part of the culture. So again, time. The other that comes to mind, and I've got a few, and we can certainly discuss some of your experiences as well, is eye contact, okay? So in the Mexican culture, I mean, as well as the U.S. culture, eye contact means a form of respect, engaged, interested, correct? Well, in the Mexican culture, it goes further than that. It is the ultimate form of respect that one can give another in a face-to-face conversation is having that eye contact. And so I've seen this where the eye contact is a little bit more, and so it's not meant to, we can also say, well, maybe the eye contact was a bit more, a bit much. Well, again, it's part of the culture, and it's a form of respect. Another, if a person from the Mexican culture was to say to me, hey, I'll call you in a bit. I'll call you in a bit. All right? That I call you in a bit, and the American culture might mean, well, I'll call you back, let's say by phone or whatnot. It might mean 20 minutes, I don't know, an hour. I'll call you in just a bit, something like that. Let's say we saw each other in the hallway. In the Mexican culture, if I hear from someone say, I'll call you in a bit, I may not hear from that person for several days. Again, it's not meant, or may not hear from that person again, right? Again, it's just part of the culture. This just fluid for time is not as tight as it is. And then finally, and another example here is oftentimes I see, and I have done this and experienced it, grew up with this, where no means yes or yes means no. The more common one is here. Let's say to say no is often difficult. To reject an invitation is often difficult. So perhaps someone from a Mexican perspective might find another way of not saying no and later follow up with either not calling back or returning emails or, again, ways not to be direct with a straight no. In the American culture, we see that it's maybe we don't want to accept an invitation. We might softly or maybe even straightforward say no, but we sort of lay it out there. Here, that's another difference in the Mexican culture. So once again, it's not right or wrong. It's just part of this culture for us to understand. And then finally, another last example is that I notice is in eating at the table. And eating at the table, one last example here, and I'll turn it back to my colleague, Dr. Telleria, is it's interesting how in the U.S. culture, we eat, we talk, and we sort of finish up and leave to our respective appointments thereafter or wherever we need to be. In the Mexican culture, it's not the case. So we eat. One difference is we tend to put our hands and our arms on the table, all right? In the American culture, I sort of see that it's more on the lap. And then after finishing our meal, the Mexican culture would like to stay and talk a little bit. This is called sobremesa, and it just means on top of the table if we translate that word for word, where after eating, we stay for a bit and we talk, all right? We just talk about whatever we want to talk about and so forth. So if a person wants to stay and talk from Mexican culture, again, this is part of the culture that you might see or experience. And so be prepared for a situation like that in case that was to come up. All right, very good. So again, at the end, we will certainly open it up for comments and questions. Let me follow up now with Dr. Telleria.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez first and Dr. Escobedo also. Just want to kind of bring this to a little bit of closure and then open it up for some questions. But I do want to finish with some strategies in the classroom. And, for example, ask students which of the two terms he or she identifies with, or if neither, okay? Because Hispanic, again, or Latino is more than just a term. It's an issue of identity, and it's an issue of self-identification. So what students identify with. I was just having a conversation here with one of our colleagues, and a lady from Trinidad and Tobago is a Trinidadian, okay? For her, African American or Latino has no meaning. The same with me. Okay, if I was born in the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, I'm most likely black. Well, African American is the correct term these days. So that person, that Nicaraguan who happens to be African American or black, however you want to say it, has no ties with the African American culture, because African American has no meaning to that person. So I think it's important, and we didn't touch upon the importance of the African roots in Hispanic and Latino culture, especially in the Caribbean, which has a high percentage of Afro-Hispanics, especially Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, okay, and the other islands who, by the way, some of them don't speak Spanish, okay, but they are in Latin America, okay, like Trinidad and Tobago and other islands. So I think that's important. The second point to make is you want to promote a conversation around international themes, specifically themes that have to do with Hispanics or Latinos. And if in doing so, you want to make sure that you differentiate between the issues that are issues for Latin America, or that are issues that are important for Latin Americans, versus issues that are important for Latinos or Latinas in the U.S. Because, again, these are two different groups with two different realities and two different needs and goals and expectations. Okay, so that's important. And then the last point is to promote and encourage self-assessment of cultural intelligence. Okay, so you always want to try and the best way to try and identify and to try and manage Hispanics or Latinos is by being more well-versed and more knowledgeable of how to properly identify, and by allowing those students who are Hispanic, Latino, or who may come across as, and perhaps you are not sure, to allow them for them to self-identify through their discussion responses, or perhaps in the chats, in the contact the instructor or the cafe, the class cafe, where you have some opportunities to talk to students one-on-one. That might be a good opportunity to engage with students, to learn and kind of put one and two together to try and figure out where they might lie in the Hispanic-Latino map, which doesn't mean that you're going to get it 100% right every time, because you're not. Okay, because we don't. We Hispanics or Latinos, we still have no clue with many people. Okay. Lastly, before I open it up to questions, some words of advice. Don't assume. Remember to differentiate between the Latino cultural context of the United States versus the Latin American context of outside of the U.S. and Hispanic. Hispanic being from the Iberian, the Iberian Peninsula, which includes Spain and Portugal. Okay, and finally, is just I'll leave you with this: there is no such thing as Hispanic food or Latino music or Latino literature. Okay, there may very well be literature that is written by Latin American writers, Latin American authors. Some of them may associate as Hispanic, others may associate or self-identify as Latinos or Latinas. Okay, food from Venezuela is very different than food from Nicaragua and Cuba and El Salvador and Mexico. Okay, so going and saying, let's go have some Latino food is just not correct. You want to avoid those stereotypes and putting everyone in that same bag. I think we made that point very important in our live presentation. I think it's an important point to end this presentation with it. You don't want to put all of us into one box. You want to separate us into the little boxes. And I know it takes a little more work, But with Hispanics and Latinos in your courses and colleagues and students, it's going to go a long way and pay dividends in the end. So with that, I thank you, and I will open it up for questions.
Can I add something that I wanted to clarify before? Hello?
Absolutely.
There are the cultural meaning of words. For example, the word discussion. In our classroom, we have a section that is called discussion. The cultural meaning of the word discussion is very informal. So students may get the impression that participating in the discussion is not as important as submitting a paper. So be aware. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that events also have different cultural meaning. For example, if I'm going to a wedding, the cultural meaning allows me the flexibility to be late. But if I'm going to an interview or I'm going to my work, then the cultural meaning of that event forces me to be on time. Please remember, never do a linguistic translation, but always look for the cultural meaning of the events and the words that you are using to convey a message.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Questions, comments? Do we have anybody on the line?
Yes, they're on the line. They're just muted. We have one person raising her hand, so 1 second, please. Nancy, I think I saw your hand up. Your phone should be on. Would you like to try? Nancy, I'm not sure if you have your microphone on or if you've called in, but I have enabled your microphone. You can try. If it's not working, we do have multiple attendees who are typing in the chat area, so feel free to do that as well.
Remember that I don't have any visual information in front of me.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Yes, your colleagues are doing a fantastic job of monitoring the discussion board in the chat area, and they've been having excellent.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So this is Mario Castro, and I grew up. My birth certificate says that I'm white. That's what my birth certificate says. But I progressed, and I've changed lots of titles, including Hispanic, Spanish, Mexican, Mexican-American. And so I think the important point is that, well, in my last census form indicated that I was a person who was another race besides black, white, Asian, and Pacific Islander. So we need to know that that race is mutable, unlike what the judiciary thinks. Race can change. I've been all over the globe, depending on where I lived at a particular time. So it can change. So that's something else that we need to keep in mind.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to say, on that note, you raised a very important point, and we because of the time, we didn't include it, but there are Arab, Hispanic, Latinos. There are Asian, or Chinese, Korean, Japanese that might look Japanese, Chinese, or Korean, but perhaps don't even speak Chinese, Japanese, or Korean because they were born in Latin America and they're just as Latin Americans as any. And so what you're saying is very true. And again, it just plays into the complexity of the Hispanic and Latino cultural divide, if you will, and how to identify correctly because there's just so many different variations.
Yes, my godmother was of Chinese ancestry, but she was a Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, you are mixing race with ethnicity. One thing is the race of the individual, and the other one would be the ethnicity.
Yes.
Good point.
Okay, are there any other final questions or comments for our presenters? They've done a fantastic job here, and the chat area has just been exploding throughout, which has been fantastic. But all I'm going to do, if it's okay with the presenters at this point, is just advance the slide for our College of Education faculty just to give them that link that they need. But please continue, and at the top of the hour, I will go ahead and allow you all to make some final comments. I just wanted to let you know that you will be getting an audio recording of this webinar as well as all the slides that are here, and we will definitely keep you posted if our wonderful presenters will do a part 2, which I'm hearing a lot of conversation here in the chat area asking for that, so I think that would be fantastic, and to hear student perspective as well. We will certainly keep you posted of that through CFE. And in the meantime, I have forwarded the slide for anyone who needs that continuing education credit. So that link is at the bottom of the screen. Hopefully you'll be able to get your credit via there. If you have any issues with that, please contact the Center for Faculty Excellence, and they can certainly assist you if you should have any trouble. And I'll turn it over to our presenters now for their final thank yous. And once again, thank you everybody for joining us.
If I may, this is Dr. Escobedo. Just to point it out here, perhaps for part 2, we could include in the discussion student perspectives on this topic, Hispanic versus Latino, and perhaps some of the rivalries. There are a lot of rivalries that I could talk about in another session between, for instance, Spain and Mexico. And there's reasons for all that, and a lot of history in those two. I can also talk about others. So that might be some other topic we can include if we do come up with part 2. So again, it's been a pleasure. Thank you all for attending. I'll pass it over to Dr. Telleria and Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you, Dr. Escobedo. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been my pleasure. I think we've raised some very important points, and I agree that for a part 2, those points, including some students, would be very useful, and perhaps touching up on some other aspects that we, just because of time, we couldn't get to. So I thank you again, and I will pass it on to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Hernandez.
It was my pleasure participating in this dialogue, and I hope we continue with additional information in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and we wish you a pleasant afternoon. And once again, thank you to our presenters. Fantastic job. And as Dr. Boftain said, muchas gracias.
Deepa?
Yes, it is.
Yes, I just wanted, last but not least, I wanted to thank you for your wonderful job in organizing this and leading the discussion. So thank you very much also.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I wish you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.